Hello, folks. So we are back with child development, which is chapter 13. We had talked about initial development, teratogens. We have talked about uh, behavior and perceptual abilities at birth, uh, emotions and emotional developments, and finally, we started the topic of cognitive development by looking at language first. So now let's um, let's continue the topic of cognitive development and look at thoughts and thinking. Um, when we look at this topic, what happens in terms of cognitive ability, of course, structuralist explanation of cognition involves many different subsystems like short-term memory, long-term memory, attention, and so on. So we won't be going into that kind of detail. We'll be talking about more holistic approaches. Um, Primarily, we'll be talking about um, Piagetian theory by a psychologist called Piaget, um, and critiques of that, including Vygotsky, and also we'll be talking about some theories and methodologies that are underlying these ideas. So, first point about children's thinking ability is noted far back, as Piaget certainly noted, that children, the way children think, the way their cognition functions is distinctly different from adult abilities. So, for example, for a very young child, um, if you show them an object, they're interested in, then looking at it, you hide it, and they lose interest. In other words, only while, for very young children, only while they are perceiving a stimulus directly uh, do they cognitively process it. When it disappears from sight, it disappears from thought. Unlike us, who can hold a idea in mind even when the object is not directly in our senses. So this is a topic that we'll pick up on a little bit later. But Piaget used it as a basis for arguing that there are stage-like discontinuities, stage-like differences between adult thinking patterns and child thinking patterns. And what's happening during development is stage progressions. So this was one of his key ideas. Anyway, so let's start with Piaget and his ideas. Piaget was one of those annoying geniuses. He published his first peer-reviewed paper at age 9 or 10. Was offered directorship of a research institution at 18 because they just read his papers, didn't know it was a high school kid. He was friends with Einstein and they collaborated together. So he was unusually sort of outstanding thinker. And he was very, very interested in the, he opened up the question of cognition by looking at where do thoughts occur. When you take a kind of thought, what is its earliest time at development that you can identify it happening? Um, so he called this genetic epistemology, looking at the genetic or genesis origins of thinking abilities. And his technique was largely case studies. He looked at his own children in great detail, monitored when and how they did certain kinds of things, and he came up with a number of interesting sort of uh, ideas and concepts. So the first idea, as I've already mentioned, was his claim that cognition, development of cognition is marked by stage transitions. Uh, Children 0 to 2 years of age have one cognitive pattern, then some new structural elements become available, and if they move into a new pattern, and then a new pattern, and then a new pattern, until you reach the adult pattern. We look at those stages later. Um, and his claim was that you move from these stages due to a constructivist reason. Now, this part of his theory is definitely not the modern consensus. But his idea was, let's say I know addition and I'm trying to learn multiplication. Basically, he said you keep on practicing addition, you'll get really good at it. So you know addition and counting, and you put the two together, and you've got multiplication. So your skill development and practice at an earlier stage pushes you to the next stage in development. That was his idea. This was the constructivist idea. His claim also was that these stage patterns are domain and culture general. So if you're in the first cognitive stage of development, sensory motor stage, it doesn't matter when whether you're talking about emotions or gender or mathematics. Your thinking across all of these domains will show the same characteristic stage like properties of the stage that you're in. So this is domain general stages. And he said this occurs all over the world. It's culture general as well. And those two claims also have been significantly modified or challenged as a part of what's happened after Piaget's work. But for about 40 years, Piaget's theory was key theory, and it still in many ways describes broad patterns in children's thinking, and it's very influential in things like school curriculums and so on and so forth. How we teach children, what we expect them to be capable of doing at with what age of life. So he had these stages, and in terms of constructivism, his idea was children can add knowledge to their thinking abilities in through multiple um, mechanisms. The first of these mechanisms he called assimilation, in which um, existing structures of knowledge can accommodate the new information without a structural change in the database. So Piaget is also the first serious psychologist to look at knowledge structures. These days, I mean, we think of them as because we have computers and artificial intelligence and databases, we think of structures very naturally. So, for example, if you have your bank information, if you have a database and the database has different slots of entries. This is the account title, this is the account number, this is the date it was opened, this is the entries, debits and credits in it. So these are all subcomponents of the basic structural framework. And Piaget was the first one to ask, well, what are these basic frameworks for different kinds of human knowledge? So, and we'll talk about them a little bit as well. So, in terms of assimilation, he says one of the things that can happen during cognitive development is the child is exposed to some new information, and their existing knowledge framework is sufficient to that information can be assimilated into it. So, for example, I know that there's a category called dogs. I know that um, dog is not a general term. It has sub distinctions in it. So I've seen a spaniel. I run into an Alsatian and I say, "What's that?" And people say it's a dog. So there's no problem for me. I say, "Ah, yes, that's just a new subtype of dog." I have not had to change my knowledge framework. Right? That's the idea. Um, in contrast to this, sometimes Piaget says what happens is accommodation. Children are exposed to new knowledge, but it doesn't fit into the existing framework, and the framework has to be changed to alter it. So, for example, if I give you the example of, um, let's say we are thinking about very simple kinds of concepts. We are thinking about ice, water, and steam. Okay. And your existing framework is very simple. You say, well, you just add heat. आइस में हीट डालेंगे वाटर हो जाएगी वाटर में हीट डालेंगे तो स्टीम हो जाएगी ठीक तो ये आपका बड़ा सिंपल सा फ्रेमवर्क आ गया अब मैं आपको कहूँ कि बट व्हाट अबाउट जो हम you know if you walk in a winter morning and you see a puddle of water and there's vapor coming off it water vapor how do you fit this into a framework right go and think about it for a couple of seconds um, you had the initial concept was H2O ice, you add heat to ice, you make water, you add heat to water and you make steam. ठीक है. अब ये तो ठंडा पानी है लेकिन इसमें से कुछ निकल रहा है, तो क्या होगा? अब मसला ये है कि अब इसमें दिस कॉजेज व्हाट इज कॉल्ड एन इम्पैस, या आप इस वक्त जो आप कर रहे हैं, मोस्ट ऑफ यू, इवन दो दिस इज हाई स्कूल क्लास 7 मिडिल स्कूल साइंस क्वेश्चन दैट आई हैव आस्क्ड, या तो आप किसी किस्म की चालाकियां मार रहे हैं कि नहीं वो थोड़ा थोड़ा ये इस तरह वो या आप यू आर एट व्हाट इज कॉल्ड कॉग्निटिव इम्पैस. You can't fit this knowledge into the existing knowledge framework, and the reason is the knowledge framework is too simplistic. In order to fit vapor into this, you will have to make a much more complex network of concepts. You will say yes, there's ice, water and steam, but there are, each of these are made of molecules. Molecules have movement. Average molecular movement determines the translation, the difference between water and steam. But individual molecules can sometimes be speedier, more energetic than the average. And that's when you have water vapor in water that is not actually at boiling point. तो आप नोटिस करें, आप कितने सारे और कॉन्सेप्ट लाने पड़े. आपको मॉलिक्यूल्स का कॉन्सेप्ट लाना पड़ा, आपको एवरेज हीट का कॉन्सेप्ट आपको मूवमेंट ऑफ मॉलिक्यूल्स में ट्रांसलेट करना पड़ा, और मूवमेंट ऑफ मॉलिक्यूल्स आपको ब्रेक डाउन करनी पड़ी एवरेज मूवमेंट ऑफ मॉलिक्यूल्स एंड इंडिविजुअल डिफरेंसेस ऑफ मूवमेंट रेट्स इन मॉलिक्यूल्स. ये सारी चीजें मिला के अब आप वेपर को इस सिस्टम में एम्बेड कर सकते हैं, इसके बगैर आप नहीं कर सकते. Now, this Piaget would say and is an example of accommodation. Your initial knowledge framework could not incorporate the new information, and you had to substantially alter the actual framework of knowledge in order to accommodate this. And this he called accommodation. Either assimilation or accommodation, both of these can give rise to a third pattern of knowledge gain, which he called equilibration. In equilibration, you have an interconnected set of knowledge, आपका concept database है. You've changed one part of it, and concepts are connected to each other by logical links. When you add new knowledge at one end, that disturbs the interlinkages of logical links. And sometimes adding a new piece of information at one side causes cascading changes in the other knowledge framework, other parts of the knowledge framework. तो आपने change एक जगह ली, लेकिन उस change से बाकी चीजें there's a wave of changes that passes through the network of knowledge. So equilibration का example, let's say कि मैं आपको कहूँ कि you go to McDonald's, ठीक? और आपने कहा I want a burger, मैं आपको burger दिया, and they said would you like fries and a drink with that? And you said yeah, I'll have fries and drink with that. And I point out to you that what has just happened is what is called upsell. In other words, staff are trained, someone who's buying this, correlation say they very often buy this and this as well, offer it to them. They're trained to make certain offers, right? So now you think, wow, so a lot of things that I think were conversation and dependent on the other person being friendly and chatting with me, actually on their side is the result of training and goal states. And what other behaviors are happening which might also be maximizing goal states or macro state. So now you're looking at all the interactions that you're having in a different light, because knowledge gained at one piece is making you think of those other ways, other interaction that you had in different ways. This would be equilibration. So Piaget said these are the three mechanisms by which knowledge gain happens in children. In terms of where this knowledge is stored, again, Piaget identified some very interesting kinds of structures. And as I said, this was the first attempt to deal with um, human knowledge bases as or human thought as being primarily dependent on the structures that they're stored in. So Piaget suggested the simplest piece of structure in our knowledge database is a concept. which has a title and stores certain regularities. So your idea of a cat is, it's the name of the concept is cat. You know, it's a mammal, it's warm blooded, it has fur, it can be as a pet. So you've got a series of regularities stored in it. And for him, structures, concepts are, um, have a recursive structure. The pieces of a concept can be other concepts. So you can store concepts within a concept, and so on and so forth. तो cat के अंदर mammal है, mammal भी एक concept का नाम है, वो उसकी एक अलग regularity है. And people differ in their knowledge either because they lack certain concepts. तो अगर आपने कुछ टॉपिक्स मिस कर दिए हैं मैथमेटिक्स के, तो आगे जाके इकोनॉमिक्स पढ़ेंगे या आप फिजिक्स पढ़ेंगे, you will have a hard time understanding what's happening because you've got concept structures missing. Right? In the example I just gave you of steam, water, and so on and so forth, a lot of people can't argue your first attempt before I told you what the right answer was. जब आप कोशिश कर रहे थे कि वेपर उसी सिंपल फ्रेमवर्क में फिट हो जाए, उसमें the reason why there were logical inconsistencies in the pattern of your thinking was because you were missing certain concepts that allow the whole thing to become logically functional. So concepts have labels, they have regularities in them, and they are recursive. You can store concepts within concepts. Then you have concepts के अंदर का स्ट्रक्चर और उनके आपस में कॉन्सेप्ट जब आखिर आपस में लिंक होते हैं, इनकी लिंकेजेस हमेशा लॉजिकल होती है. दिस इज अ पार्ट ऑफ दैट, दिस इज अ काइंड ऑफ दैट, दिस इज अ सब फॉर्म ऑफ दैट, इस तरह की लॉजिकल लिंक्स होती हैं. But there are also larger knowledge frameworks which are associated together. उनकी आपस में कोई लॉजिकल रिलेशनशिप नहीं है. लेकिन the reason why those concepts are activated at the same time is because they are commonly used together. So these things are called schemas. So we have schemas for a lot of everyday activity. Right? So your idea of a friendship has in the form of a certain schema, and people may have different schemas, which is why conflicts occur. Right? So um, you know, you didn't remember my birthday. If a boy were to say this to a boy, the other boy would say, क्या दिमाग तो नहीं खराब हो गया, फिर तू पार्टी दे, तू याद रख. Right? Now this is a schema. There is no rule that says friendship involves remembering significant dates. Um, you can have, and this can be a reason of a conflict, but for people there are certain kinds of associations, uh, conceptual associations. Concepts are linked to each other. Or you can have a gender schema, right? So if I were my when I first went to England, and my computer science professor, C++, walked in the first lecture with a long pink overcoat. And I was fresh from Pakistan, right? So I'm sort of, what's happening here? And then I realized, after a while, that, the gender schemas, the idea that certain colored clothes are associated with certain genders, there's no logical requirement for it, and these are culturally variable things. Different cultures have different schemas associated. So schema is a set of concepts that are associated with each other, not logically, but because of everyday usage. You use them regularly together, and they tend to be cultural variations, individual variations in schema. But schemas, in a sense, help us function in real time by preparing our cognitive system with the information that it will need. Right? So if I go to a restaurant, I'm expecting there to be a menu and to order and so on and so forth, right? Because it's a part of a schema. Therefore, I don't have to worry every time कि अब खाना कैसे मिलेगा यहाँ पे. When you first came to LUMS, introduction to the course enrollment schema was a real problematic one. किस तरह कोर्स करते हैं, जंबील को ऐसे करते हैं, क्या करते हैं, ड्रॉप करते हैं, ऐड पीरियड क्या होता है, ड्रॉप ओनली पीरियड क्या होता है, ऐड ड्रॉप पीरियड. So now you've got a schema associated with that, and You don't have to be problem solving and thinking and finding out all the time. These sets of concepts are connected to each other, and you have an idea of exactly where you're operating in. The world is mapped onto your concept system by these sets of useful concepts that are linked to each other. That again, that's a schema. So our everyday cognition is marked by schemas. So for Piaget, cognitive development, a big part of it is continual addition of new concepts, but also continual association of concepts into schemas. Um, and so children are lost on, let's say, the first day to go to school because they have no schema, not because the concepts are lacking necessarily, um, and so on and so forth. Then you have the third structure is scripts. Scripts are basically schemas, but schemas that order a sequence of behavior. So going to the doctors, right? तो पहले आप जाते हैं, आप अपॉइंटमेंट लेते हैं, आप रिसेप्शनिस्ट के पास जाते हैं, डॉक्टर के कमरे में जाते हैं, वो कुछ टेस्ट वगैरह करता है, ये वो करता है, फिर आपको वो लिख के देते हैं कि ये होना है आपकी further tests or this is your diagnosis and this is what medicine your treatment you have to take. That's a part of your overall schema. अगर आप डॉक्टर के पास जाएं और डॉक्टर कहे हाँ जी क्या हाल चाल है, सर बताएं आजकल आप क्या करते हैं, अच्छा ये कहते हैं आज गाड़ी कौन सी चलाते हैं, मैं सोच रहा हूँ गाड़ी नहीं, आपका क्या ख्याल है कौन सी, you will think there's something strange going on because it's a deviation from the schema. This is a socialization schema, not a socialization script, not a doctor's office script. But schemas and scripts are the same thing, except scripts are to do with sequences of behaviors. That's the key. Again, for Piaget, what's happening in development is children are developing scripts for more and more occasions, and that's a part of the knowledge game that we are talking about. So these are knowledge structures. Those three were the knowledge gain mechanisms, and these resulted sort of in stage progression. The children move from one to the second to the third to the fourth stage. That was Piaget's idea. Now, his stages, which were the most lasting influence in terms of ideas, he claimed that from 0 to 2 years of age, children were in what he called the sensory motor stage. Their ability to deal with the world is entirely in terms of movement and what is immediately in their perceptual senses. तो आपको ये कोई बच्चे को चीज दिखाई, उससे खेलेंगे, वो उसे चखेंगे, they're interacting using their full set of senses. They'll smell it, they'll taste it, they'll move it around to feel its shape. Their interactions with the world are based on sensory experience and uh, motor movement. They are not interested in things further away. वो देखो कश्मीर के पहाड़ नजर आ रहे हैं, उनको कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ा क्योंकि they can't interact. They're interested in things that they can interact with. That's what their cognitive system is designed to do at that stage. They have no permanent conceptual record. Okay? In the sense that they recognize an object. So if they've played with it, you take it away, now they're not interested in it. You bring it back, they'll remember it, but the point is, while it's not on their senses, they are not able to handle it. So they can't handle their concept. They are beginning to have concepts, but they can't handle their concepts in a skillful way, apart from handling them physically and in their senses. सोच में वो अपने concepts को manipulate नहीं कर सकते. That's his idea. And he says this children at this stage lack what he calls object permanence. When objects disappear from the senses, their ability to cognitively manipulate those objects disappears as well. And for Piaget, at around 18 months, 1.5 years, 18 months, 2 years, you have development of object permanence. Now, if children are able to manipulate concepts of ideas or objects in the world, even though the objects are not in their senses. So now if you hide something from children, children will look for it because it's still in their mind. I want to know what it was, right? So they'll search for it till they find it. This is the age in which peekaboo becomes fun because when you disappear, they're not uninterested anymore. They know it's still there, and you do that. It's all very funny, and they enjoy it. So 0 to 2 years, sensory motor stage, ability to manipulate concepts. Concepts are just beginning to become added, but they can't manipulate the concepts. They can't access them until they're in there, unless they're currently in the sensory domain and motor domain. And children like physical, they're interested in concepts that they can physically interact with. That's why the sensory motor as a movement stage of development. Once object permanence develops, and now they can play around with concepts that they are not directly in their senses and that they are not directly touching either. So now they're beginning to have, in a sense, a data record of the world in terms of its concepts and arrangement between concepts, apart from the real world. So उन्होंने दुनिया भी देखी है और दुनिया के बारे में एक symbol system भी construct कर लिया है, which they can examine, manipulate in their minds. But their mental concept, sort of description of the world and the real world in this stage, pre-operational stage, is significantly different from the real world in characteristic ways. So there are kinds of symbol manipulation that they can't do, and there are kinds of ways in which their concepts are different from the real world. And this shows itself in characteristic patterns of difference. So children at this age, 2 to 7 years of age, tend, Piaget said, to be egocentric. Now, this doesn't mean that they are selfish. What he meant by this is they have a real difficulty in understanding how other people's understanding and cognitive concept system of the world may be different from their own. The classic test of egocentricity is the so-called Sally Ann paradigm. It's a way of testing very young children. Uh, in Sally Ann paradigm, you have a puppet, Sally Ann, and the child is looking, you say, hey, this is Sally Ann. And there are 3 cups on the table. और कहते हैं Sally Ann, the puppet, really likes toffees. And you take a toffee and you say, I'm now going to hide the toffee. And you hide the toffee inside one of the cups. Okay? Sally Ann, the puppet, is watching. And you say, quick, where is Sally Ann going to look for the toffee? And they say, yeah, this one, where you just hid it. Okay, no problem. So you say, okay, hiding the toffee again. Sally Ann's looking. Now Sally Ann, the puppet, goes outside the room. And the experimenter says, shh, moves the toffee into and puts it under a different cup. And now Sally Ann, the puppet, comes back inside the room. And you ask the kid, where is Sally Ann going to look for the toffee? Now, there are one of 2 answers. The adults would answer, Sally Ann will look where Sally Ann last saw the toffee. But that's not what the kids at this age answer. They say, Sally Ann, they say they look where the toffee is. In other words, they can't tell how Sally Ann's beliefs about where the toffee is going to be different from their own because Sally Ann never saw the toffee being switched. Okay? So they are, people at this age are bad at predicting the mental states of others because they don't have a good idea about how mental states are caused and how viewing the world from different perspectives may alter your knowledge and belief in mental states. They don't understand that fully at all. So Piaget believed children this age are egocentric, and to a great extent they are. Again, this is something that we'll challenge later on. The um, and this is why children in this stage, 5, 6 years of age, they can't really lie. I mean, they can tell. They can. Who did that? Ask mommy. Not me. The reason they are saying not me is they have said it before accidentally, and they've been reinforced for it because they haven't been punished. What they can't do, they'll give misstatements at this age, but what they can't do is they can't do mental manipulation. So a full-blown lie is, I will tell them this and they'll believe it because they think that. Now, this kind of calculation can't be done by children this age. because their mental concept sort of description of the universe is different and not as complex as the real world. It's still substantially simplified. Another pattern that they have at this stage is they lack conservation ability. Conservation ability is basically um, knowing children at this age will know that adding or subtracting will change amount or number. So if you put 4 coins in a row and you add 2 coins, 2 rows of coins, दोनों में 4 हैं, आप एक में एक और कॉइन डाल देते हैं और आप कहते हैं अब किस रो में ज्यादा कॉइन्स हैं, वो कहेंगे ये 5 वाली में ज्यादा, ठीक है. They know that adding increases number, removing lowers number. What they don't know is that certain other alterations leaves amount and number conserved. तो आप 2 rows of coins लगाएं this age and they कितने हैं? Equal? Yes, equal. Then you stretch out one of the rows so the coins are have longer space and you say अब किसमें ज़्यादा है? And they'll say इस वाली में ज़्यादा है, which you just stretched out. So they don't know that changing distribution doesn't change number. Similarly, kids this age, you know, so दो babies के लिए आपने milk डाला, बड़े भाई या बहन को आपने ज़्यादा दे दिया, छोटे बहन मुझे बराबर चाहिए. What you can do is you take a narrower glass, उनके छोटे ग्लास में कम मिलके उसमें डालें, उसमें पोर कर दें. उसका लेवल, क्योंकि नैरो ग्लास उसका लेवल हाई हो जाएगा, वो कहेगा अब इसने आपके पास ज्यादा दिया, एंड दे विल बी वेरी हैप्पी, मुझे अब ज्यादा मिल गया, because they think level means amount. Similarly, you put plate of food on a plate. Why is so my brother getting more food than me? So you just spread out their food so it occupies greater space, and now they say, yeah, now I've got. So again, they don't know that spatial redistribution doesn't alter amount or number. This is called lack of conservation. They don't know certain actions leave number and amount conserved. Okay. So this again is a characteristic way in which their mental symbol of the world, which for them is reality. For all of us, our mental image of the world is all that we actually know. But children have their mental image of the world is systematically simplified and different. Conservation is one of the ways in which it is different from how it's going to be in the adult stage. Another pattern again is reversibility. They don't do reversibility very well. Again, this happens in different domains. Remember, Piaget's theory of stages are domain general. So if you ask them, what's 2 plus 4? And very often they can count. They say 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2 plus 4 is 6. Okay. Now what is 4 plus 2? They'll have to do the counting again. They don't know 2 plus 4 is the same as 4 plus 2. They can't reverse it. It's challenging for them. Similarly, you can ask, so do you have an older brother? Yes, Ali. Does Ali have brothers? No. Again, a lack of reversibility. Uh, so these are characteristic ways in which their thinking patterns are different. और इनमें से खास तौर पे egocentricity के इसका मैंने जिक्र किया. That has been linked to a subsystem still under development. This was not Piaget's claim. This is the modern sort of interpretation. क्योंकि Piaget का तो ख्याल था कि सब कुछ constructivism से हो रहा है. You practice and you eventually move beyond as you gain skills. But these days we would say there's a biological or structural explanation which says there's a subsystem that is still developing in cognition. And this is the theory of mind module, TOMM, theory of mind module. Theory of mind module is like the language module. It's a built-in system that helps us gain an understanding of other people. Very significant part of the theory of mind module is supposed to be mirror neurons, which we talked about in the last module. So theory of mind module allows you to empathize, allows you to understand how other people get the belief states that they do. And when it's developed fully, we can understand other people's frames of mind very well. Another sort of classic sort of mistake that children will make at this age, a very nice example is, children will say the trees are sort of moving in the wind, and they'll say, look, the tree is shaking its head. And you'd say, oh, that's so sweet. But actually, they're making a very logical statement. They know enough to know that there are objects in the world that move only when we touch them, animate objects. Okay? Then there are objects in the world that move when they want to, animate objects, cats, dogs, people. They look at a tree, they can't see anything moving the tree. Wind is invisible, right? And the tree is moving, and therefore it must be animate. And animate things move because they want to, because they have internal states of thoughts and desires and so on. So that's the kind of mistake that they will classically make. And it depends, it doesn't matter whether it's mathematics or interpersonal relationship, reversibility. दोनों जगह आपको lack of reversibility नजर आएगी, because a pre-operational thinker, claimed Piaget, is a pre-operational in their thinking in all domains. Then you have a concrete operational stage, 7 to 12 years of age. यहाँ पे they are they've solved the problems of uh, egocentricity, conservation, and so on to a considerable extent. So they are, um, but they have solved these problems, claim Piaget, by trial and error. They don't have abstract reasons why this is the case. So they'll answer these questions correctly, but they don't have a coherent answer for why this is the way that it is. And they are not able to understand sort of abstract concepts which are not based on concrete examples like patriotism. Right? पेट्रियटिज्म को ये बता सकेंगे कि हाँ ये आप 14 अगस्त को आप झंडा गाते हैं और ये करते हैं नेशनल, क्यों गाते हैं, क्योंकि सभी गा रहे हैं. So for them, patriotism is not a form of morality. It doesn't derive from morality. It derives from group membership, which is concrete. So that's the concrete operational stage, 7 to 12. Then Piaget said from around 12 and so onwards, people are able to think abstractly as well. And now their thinking is qualitatively the same as adult thinking. उसमें new concepts वगैरह add होते रहेंगे. The knowledge gain systems are still operating, but up there is no stage transition left. Children are thinking in as sophisticated a set of patterns as adults. So these are Piaget's ideas, and they're very, very influential in the sense of school curriculum में किस चीज पे आप concentrate करते हैं. The idea is there's no point teaching 8-year, 10-year-olds abstract concepts like patriotism and so on. वो patterns तो सीख जाएंगे. They will not uh, be able to understand the underlying morality of it. That's the kind of idea that. So Piaget is working in the West. In the Soviet Union, you have Vygotsky, who disagrees significantly with Piaget in terms of socio-cultural influences. He thinks there's no culture general patterns of thinking. Our thinking right from the very beginning is very, very influenced by culture. And he suggested that culture sort of takes the trajectory of thinking in one direction or another direction by, for example, having words and concepts that are in common use. In one set of cultures, for example, in animistic culture like Japan, you'll be talking about nature and how powerful it is and how your ancestors are connected to you. They don't have, in a sense, a strong concept of God to whom you owe duties. You owe duties to your society and to your ancestors and to the environment around you, but not abstractly to God. And that means there's going to be a very different set of ways in which we conceptualize causality, conceptualize locus of control, and all these kinds of things. So, for Vygotsky, culture really influences the fundamental sets of concepts that children are exposed to, and therefore the patterns and domains of their thinking. He also says when you hear something around yourself, then children start internalizing by private speech. They start repeating things to yourself, or you mustn't do that, that's bad. Mummy says that's bad. But this is good. When we do this, mummy is really happy, right? So he's saying these patterns of speech also start to direct and monitor their knowledge and behavior And again, this true is coming from their internalization of the culture um, that they happen to be in. So for him, there's culture-specific patterns of cognitive knowledge growth. He's not inclined to view that there are universal stages or universality of developmental direction. He thinks that it's culturally distinct, and so he thinks human beings are actually far more diverse than Piaget would suggest. And I think in many ways he's right as well, although Piaget is not totally wrong. So, what are the current views of what happens during cognitive development? Well, um, these days, rather than Piaget's hard stages, कि आप एक stage में हैं, तो आपका हर pattern वही stage में है. These days, through more sensitive testing, we have identified that stages come in overlapping waves. That's how development goes rather than these concrete stages. So it's possible that a domain of your thinking, when you're really interested in mathematics, you can be quite abstract at a very young age in terms of your thinking ability. And while in other ways, you're fairly a concrete thinker. So how do we know this? Have we come to the more detailed knowledge? Well, Piaget, in terms of his technique, was limited to observation and case studies. Um, there are two major techniques that have been developed since then, which allow us to test something much more sensitively. One is what is called habituation studies, habituation paradigm. I gave you an example of this. What you will do to study habituation in very young children who can't speak and even sometimes can't even behave very much, can't do lots of behavior, is you look at their heart rate and breathing patterns, or the way that they're sucking a nipple or something. When they find something unusual, their heart rate jumps as they pay attention to it. Then, as they register it, understand it, their heart rate goes down again. Right? So, if you want to know, do they have long-term memory or do they have certain knowledge or expectations about the world? You show them the object, heart rate goes up, remove it, you show it again the next day. If they have zero memory of it, their heart rate should jump exactly as it did last time. If they're kind of familiar with it, their heart rate will jump a little bit but settle down more quickly. So, very young babies can be tested in terms of their knowledge using the habituation technique. And that tells us um, very interesting things about what children know at a very young age. Then we have the preferential looking technique. Again, this is used with very young children. You show them two images. If they are familiar with one, they tend to spend most of their time looking at the other one. Or if one of them is unusual, in other words, one of them is as they expected, it is in line with their current knowledge, and one of them is unusual, unexpected, again, they'll prefer to look at the unexpected one. That's the preferential looking sort of design. And using this, you can test very young children. You find they know a lot more than we thought, or Piaget thought that they did. So they are um, so using these techniques, we understand that they're not so rigid in their stages. Within subject design, so instead of treating children as lumps, you use how a single child is thinking about mathematics or how food is distributed and so on. What you find is that children are varied in their strategies. Sometimes they'll make a very sophisticated conclusion. Sometimes they'll be very simplistic. So there's a variation of strategies and over time, they settle into the more successful strategies for each occasion. So again, it's there are characteristic average patterns to children's thinking, but there's a lot of variation also. Um, so as I said, they are these characteristic ways in which we've discovered this using habituation and preferential looking. And using these techniques, we found in many ways Piaget was not correct. So children, for example, are not consistently as egocentric as Piaget thought they were. So 4-year-olds who are not supposed to have theory of mind will use simpler language when talking to 2-year-olds. They'll start, they'll also talk in parentese, if you notice with young kids. They're young themselves, but they're talking parentese to younger kids. So they'll do that and they'll simplify what they're saying. Now, this adjustment means they're compensating for a simpler mental state, which shows some ability to know other mental states. Um, Also, with if you ask the question just right, they'll even succeed in Sally Ann paradigm kind of questions. So, you make a little maze and you say, oh, here's Mr. Policeman, he's chasing Mr. Cat. Where shall Mr. Cat hide? Children will very often hide the cat where Mr. Policeman can't see it, but they can. So again, they are making some compensation for another person's position and state in the world. So they show some ability to do that. Similarly, habituation or preferential looking, so you find children have some degree of object permanence. Um, so children, a few hours after birth, show object permanence and mathematical abilities in particular ways. Kis tarah, you show them a tube and you put ping pong balls in a tube. You put 3 ping pong balls in. It's a trick tube क्योंकि पीछे से आप वो निकाल रहे हैं लेकिन वो नजर नहीं आ रहा बच्चों को आपने ट्यूब में 3 बॉल्स डाली और खोली ट्यूब तो उसमें सिर्फ एक बॉल पड़ी थी चिल्ड्रंस हार्ट रेट सडनली जंप्स ये क्या हुआ whereas आपने 3 बॉल्स डाली और खोला और अंदर 3 ही बॉल्स थी the heart rate doesn't jump as much. This is showing us two things. One, children have very simple kinds of mathematical and counting abilities, at least for small numbers, pretty much at birth. This has been tested a couple of hours after birth. And they do have a kind of object permanence क्योंकि आपने वो balls डाली थी. The balls were lost to sight, but they still had an idea how many they should be. So these days, we think that there are lots of structural subsystems which are behind object permanence, like working memory and so on and so forth. These structural systems are still developing, they're still growing links to each other during development. And testing sensitively using these techniques, आपको hints मिलेंगी कि ये होता है. But Piaget was right that at particular ages, those subsystems become fully connected and integrated, and they become reliable parts of the cognitive or thinking apparatus, and people start showing these characteristic behaviors on average in their behavior. So that is what happens. This idea that structural units are there and they're growing and developing, this is at odds with Piaget's constructivist view of where these abilities and stage transitions come from. So these days we have a much more nature rather than nurture based view of cognition. You have cognition depends on lots of sub modules. They are growing and developing and they're connecting links with each other and they become reliably available to our cognitive system at different stages of development. That's how the modern interpretation would go. Now we move to sort of cultural influences also. And over here also, Piaget's idea of universality has been challenged, and Vygotsky's ideas have some of Vygotsky's ideas are strongly supported. So, for example, you find that there are characteristic advantages and early developments in certain cognitive abilities depending on cultural influences. So, for example, your nomadic hunters, hunter-gatherers, tend to have very well developed spatial senses, um, and they're able to dead reckon directions much better than people who lived in other kinds of other kinds of environmental influences. Agricultural, there are people in agricultural societies have better quantification and conceptual abilities at identifying plants and so on and so forth. So these are characteristic patterns in cognition which are culturally influenced. It's not as universal a pattern as Piaget had thought. Human beings can be very widely variable. So now we move to an exact domain, a particular domain of cognition, a very important one, which is moral development. How does our thinking about um, what is right and what is wrong, and how we order and uh, organize our behavior to be in line with morality and avoid immorality. how does this develop, right? So kids, of course, will do anything, right? ये toy उसका मैं लेके जा रहा हूँ, too bad, right? और उन्होंने ढूंढ डाल दिया कि नहीं मुझे चाहिए. Now, adults, okay, Pakistani elite apart, the rest of adults have some idea of what is right and wrong and how, what you should take and what you should not take. Um, so how does this develop? One major theorist here was Kohlberg, and he was very influenced by Piagetian theory, and he thought that the domain of moral reasoning was going to show the same kind of patterns. And he tested people's moral reasoning, made them answer certain kinds of questions, like, for example, um, the teacher told you not to take so and so's pencil, but you don't have anything to write with. Should you take the pencil? Um, your ceiling is wrong, but your wife is very ill. She really needs the medicine. Should you go into a break into a store and steal the medicine? So he sets up these moral dilemmas and asks people their reasons why they would do it and not do it and why. Why? And he argues that there are these multiple stages. So in the initial stage, people are fear punishment and look to rewards, and that's the basic reasoning that they have along which they discriminate. So why shouldn't I do this? Because mummy will be angry. Why shouldn't I do this? Because teacher will. If why should I do this? Because teacher will give me a present. That's about the limit of their moral reasoning. Then later, Holberg says they move into a conformity and loyalty stage, stage two, in which they will give reasons of group. So why do you do this? Suppose I were to punish you for doing this, I would still do it because I'm a proud Pakistani. Why are you sharing a mask, donating masks? Don't you think you need them? What will happen if you need them? That's all right. It's my duty. It's my sense of membership to the society means I must donate them. So people are acting out of conformity and loyalty to broader group memberships. But still, if you say, well, so and so in that culture, you're supposed to do this, in this culture, you're supposed to do that. And they'll say, yeah, well, so they have no further argument. They'll say just they have sort of a cultural relativity. We do this and that's the way it goes. हमारे culture में होता है, उनके culture में होगा, गलत है. So something like that. Right? Then Kohlberg said, not everybody moves to the third stage. In the third stage of moral reasoning, you able to do abstract thinking, and you become a universalist thinker. So you will say something like, yes, this is all sentient beings need choices. In my culture, women are not allowed certain choices of this, that, the other, and that's wrong, even though it's my culture, but it's wrong. So they have an abstract, independent, transcendental way of thinking about reasoning beyond cultural loyalties and conformity, and beyond the first stage, fear of punishment, and so on and so forth. So for Piaget, for Kohlberg, young children think in stage one, stage two, young adults think in stage two, and most adults think in stage two as well. Small number of adults move to stage three. That was his Kohlberg's claim. Um, but his sort of framework, when people started working on it a little more, they found something very curious, which is while his framework sort of, yes, it characterizes moral reasoning, it actually doesn't characterize moral behavior. And what you find is people's moral ability is improving, but their moral behavior is not improving and may even get worse. So they're getting better at coming up with excuses and rationalizations of their behavior. For example, undergraduates. We all know that. Just kidding. All right. So to resolve this dilemma, okay, the initial idea was moral reasoning improves, and that should be the engine that shows consistent improvement of moral behavior as well. But you find they are disconnected; they don't connect up as easily, and this led people to think that moral domain consists of cognition, yes, but also emotions, and finally behavior. So, uh, what 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 sort of explains moral behavior is not just your ability to think about moral questions, but also what emotion they make you feel, whether they make you feel empathy or shame or guilt. And that will then explains the overall pattern of behavior in much more effective way than simple development of uh, moral um, moral thinking. Again, unlike Piaget's conclusion, people also found that children were not so stage-like, Goldberg stage-like. Um, Particularly when you started to pay attention to what was happening in terms of their emotion and in terms of their behavior as well, instead of just trying to check their reasoning by questions. When you started looking at their emotional responses on there, you found the picture was much more complex. So children who were supposed to be in the first stage of Kohlberg's reasoning, avoiding punishment and looking for reward, they would say, no, even if the teacher says I can hit this kid, I don't think it's right because it hurts them. So they're using empathy. So empathy will, in a sense, compensate for their stage one pattern of thinking, and their moral behavior and moral system will deviate from Kohlberg stages when you think about what's happening emotionally as well. And this has been developed into the idea that we are born with, again, notice Kohlberg's system is very constructivist. You think about and you practice thinking about moral dilemmas, and that moves you on to the next stage of moral thinking. But this is, recent developments have shown a much more uh, nurture based approach that you have moral modules. So you have a series of moral senses, moral sort of taste buds that activate certain emotions. And this interacts with the socialization that you're getting, what you're being rewarded and punished for, to uh, show your characteristic patterns of behavior. And children are different in their variation of this moral package. One very interesting book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt um, suggests that people's characteristic political positions, whether you are conservative or liberal, depends on the underlying sense of sort of moral emotions, moral package that you have in childhood. And of course, later experiences strengthen or weaken it. But he says there's a distinction there. In particular, he suggests conservatives have stronger emotional responses to group elements like hierarchy and cohesion. So, should I walk around naked? Right? I'm not harming anyone. Right? So a lot of people would say, well, liberals would argue, yes, increased number of choices. If you want it, it's as long as it's not for them. The boundary is harm. That's the key boundary, which they're very sensitive to, and they're not so sensitive to hierarchy and adherence to groups. Whereas for conservatives, they just feel a stronger emotional response to that kind of thing. It's wrong. It's not in our culture. You shouldn't do it. It sort of gives them a stronger emotional reaction. Whereas if they sort of beat somebody for doing this, right? Okay, I know Chitta Maras. Okay. For a liberal who has a much stronger reaction to injury, they would say there's no reason to cause an individual injury for a moral violation of group standards, as long as they're not harming anyone. Right? So the the amount of emotional responses to particular situations, Haidt suggests, is characteristically different. Um, Conservatives have a larger set of things to which they have emotion responses. Liberals have a smaller set to them, or they have weaker responses to the other two. And that in turn means they have different viewpoints to certain moral questions. Um, and the classic question that talks about is, your neighbor's dog died naturally. It's not a disease or anything. It's perfectly eatable meat. Neighbor doesn't know. Should you eat it? You're not harming anyone, right? So that's a classic kind of dilemma in which your another element he talks about is body integrity, whether messing with taking apart a body and fiddling about with it causes a revulsion, strong revulsion or not. And this again, people are different in terms of the reactions. So, in terms of moral development, emotions are a part of what's a part of it, and then socialization interplays with this and gives rise to overall patterns of moral thinking plus moral behavior plus emotional responses. And there's a nature nurture interaction, and which is why children, not all children respond the same way to the same socialization. You give some children uh, strict discipline and they will turn hostile. Other children will quickly learn with discipline how to obey certain moral standards. And it's because they're coming with a different set of built-in emotional responses. Um, what you also find in terms of sort of socializing and teaching children moral behavior is some children are naturally more robust. So um, you can have a wide variety of socialization techniques. You can reward them for good behavior, punish them for bad behavior, do it inconsistently, do it consistently, and they end up more or less the same way. Whereas other children can have typically those with high distress, irritability temperaments. Again, we look at this more in personality. They are more sensitive to the kind of socialization they get. Too much punishment with these, and they become much more hostile. It's much more counterproductive. So parenting patterns, socialization patterns also need to be flexible in order to produce a right moral development trajectory. One consistent pattern that does emerge is the way parents in particular, or adults generally, socialize. One characteristic pattern of socialization is what is called power assertion. Attempts to control behavior by threats and punishments. Right? So don't do this or you'll be punished with this. Don't do that or no more, you know, TV watching for you today. So this is primarily power assertion and it's effective, but what you find is, um, as you would expect from learning theory, that it causes sometimes a adverse reaction hostility. Often parents become sort of um, stimulus control. So when they're not present, the moral behavior does not happen. Um, and this can be contrasted with induction, in which children are socialized into moral behavior by appealing to their internal abilities. So, why don't you share this toy with them? Don't you remember you're so sad when you didn't get that and nobody shared it with you? Now, how do you think they will feel when you don't share? They'll feel sad, right? That's a bad thing, right? So you're sort of enhancing their emotional responses to particular kinds of moral situations and not using primarily punishments as the pattern of training. Right? And what this tends to do is it tends to translate the locus of control of moral behavior to the individual. And this form of doing it, called induction, appealing to responsibility, empathy, helpfulness, uh, gives rise to a more long lasting sort of change in moral conduct. And it seems to do a lot of this primarily by increasing children's ability at self regulation. Now, self regulation is a variable in which children vary, uh, and it people have been very interested in it because you find it's a variable with very high predictability. So there's a simple test called the marshmallow test, which is kind of cool if you think about it. In a marshmallow test, you put a marshmallow and a bag of marshmallows in front of the kids, and you say, all right, if you don't eat the marshmallow until I come back, I'll give you the whole bag of marshmallow. If you eat it, then you just get this marshmallow. And the experimenter leaves. Here's the cruel bit: they don't actually come back till they've eaten the marshmallow. And the question is, how long can they control it? And young kids are really funny, so they can actually see them reaching out and pulling back their hands, trying to look away, and then magnetically being drawn to the marshmallow. Eventually, they eat it and look at it. The amount of delay that they can put in um, is predictive of university level education, their ability to do problem solving. It's hugely predictable. So greater self-regulation has a lot of associated positive outcomes with, and induction seems to enhance self-regulation, whereas power assertion does not tend to do that. And by self-regulation, we mean ability to delay rewards, suppress impulses, control negative emotions, pay attention. These are all subcomponents of the overall thing that we call um, negative, what we call self-regulation, and it's negatively correlated with power assertion. Though, of course, this is, as I said, this is a correlation. There might be other variables involved in this. So now we move to another domain of development, which is gender identity development. Um, and over here, the kind of concepts that we are thinking about is gender typing, your knowledge of gender schema, which is the culture appropriate roles and associations and disassociations with particular gender roles, and also your socialization into your gender roles. Again, these two can be diverse. So you can have a very acute knowledge of gender schema of your culture, but not be highly gender typed. So your own behavior is, not very strongly gender typical, but you actually have very good ability. You know what is appropriate, just or not just that you don't follow it. So people again have looked at gender identity and gender typing and gender schemas, and they've looked at nature versus nurture influences to this. In terms of biological influences, you find a lot of patterns that are emerging with development. So what you find is children, when they're around 3, 4 years of age, tend spontaneously to gender segregate, even in co-ed preschools. And there are distinct different preferences in the kind of games. So boys will do more roughhousing, more risk-taking, aggressive type of behaviors. Girls' games will be more cooperative, more social-oriented, relationship-oriented, less aggressive. And this, this is of course an overlapping sort of population. So it's not as if no girl prefers these kinds of games. There are girls that have that preference, and of course, boys prefer the opposite kind of preference as well. You also have, it's an overall preference. So girls will, they prefer their own kinds of games most times, but they play these games as well, and same with boys. But there is a overlapping but different set of preferences. And what you find also is that, speaking of biological influences, that these are correlated with the amount of prenatal exposure to testosterone. Um, the more the amount of testosterone in the placental fluid, the stronger the later preference for male typical play. Now, this, of course, there are lots of sociological explanations for this as well, and they may play, certainly play, certainly in a society like ours, they will play a huge amount of role, in the sense that the social punishment and reward signals for gender atypical behaviors will be much more immediate, much more frequent, much more systematic. But that's one layer. There's also argument, as the testosterone study shows, that there's significant nature signal coming to this as well. And another evidence for this is that rhesus monkeys show a similar set of gender-based preferences for risk-taking, roughhousing type play versus more social kinds of play. And presumably, the socialization in rhesus monkeys is not at all like human socialization, right? So the fact that they're still showing the preference suggests that in part there is a biological signal for this. Also, evidence for this being internal is the a number of case studies. The famous one of David Brenda. David was genetically a male, XY, chromosomally, Y chromosome tha. But due to and I don't want to go into details, do I know them? An early accident near birth, his genitals were damaged and removed. And the parents decided to artificially create female genitals and to raise him as a child, as a female child. And around puberty, David sort of had really gender identity crises. And when he learned what was actually the case, that he was chromosomally XY, he shifted to a male identity instead of a female one, even though he was totally socialized as a female for the first 8-10 years of life. But he reported that um, I never felt comfortable in that, and now that I know who I am, I'm much more comfortable with that. And a number of case studies suggest that there is this internal signal is fairly strong. The nature signal is fairly strong. Now, I want to clarify that this nature signal is based on brain patterns, not chromosomal patterns. So people who report that they are not comfortable with their gender, particularly if they're reporting it relatively early on in development, even if they're XY, they're genetic chromosomally males, they have male genitals, but they're saying, I'm not comfortable, I'm more comfortable being a female, particularly if they're doing it early on in development. And very often you find their brain shows structural patterns more typical of female brain. Male and female brains, again, as we've seen earlier, they overlap significantly, but there are certain differences. In these cases of these individuals, they very often have female brains, and that suggests to us that their claim that they're feeling female and they need to choose and follow a female identity should be taken very seriously. And that it is not something that you can discount very easily. It's a very strange, very powerful internal signal, is the idea. So there are evidences that internal biological signal for gender identity is fairly influential and strong, but it doesn't always correlate with chromosomes or genitals. That's the idea. There are also cognitive influences. So 9, 10 months old babies start to identify genders. Then a little bit later, they have their own gender identity. At this stage, this is one of the ways in which Piagetian theory is relevant. They have gendered identity, but they are not showing gender sort of conservation. So kids at this age will say, boys will say, I want to grow up to be mommy, and girls will say, I want to grow up to be daddy. Or if they see people wearing the clothes commonly worn by different genders, say, oh, look, he's become a man, she's become a man, or he's become a woman. So they think clothes alter gender, when of course they don't necessarily alter gender. So at 2 years or so, they're showing consistent gender identity, but they're not showing gender conservation. Uh, they start showing a whole host of um, cognitive features at 2 years as well. So they'll start consistently paying attention to their own gender, start consistently attempting to alter their own behavior to be in line with gender. So when you consistently identify, you realize you're a particular gender, you start paying attention to that gender, and you start encoding and remembering more details. Your gender schema for your gender becomes more elaborate than your gender schema for another gender. So there's a cognitive bias that happens in terms of information gain that happens quite early. At 4 years, kids are trying to attempt to define gender identity. Boys ye nahi karte, girls ye nahi karte. They're starting to do that definitional attempts at approaching gender. At 5 years, they have tend to have stable gender identity with conservation. Again, there are exceptions to this rule, and you consolidate your knowledge into a gender schema. And this is extended even in the case of metaphors, right? So, um, in languages that mark features as male versus female, uh, people this age will start doing it. Kids this age will start doing it consistently. So pink soft fuzzy things are female, spiky black metallic things are male. So they are in a sense metaphorizing their gender schema. And this time of maximum gain of gender schema is also when gender schemas tend to be most rigid. So boys will actively avoid dressing. ये मैंने नहीं पहनी है girls की होती है, ये मैंने नहीं पहनी है boys की होती है. Whereas those of us who are fashionable soon outgrow this tendency when they reach an age of maturity. That was a joke. All right. So this part of this cognitive. So there's a cognitive change in cognitive structures and your attentional structures and so on. There's also strong environmental signals, sometimes quite subtle ones that are coming in at this age. So children who are newborn, what you find is when people find out it's a boy, they'll say, "Oh, how strongly he's kicking! Oh, he's yelling really loudly. It's a boy." If it's a girl baby, oh, how sweetly look how she looks so pretty, or she's look how delicate her features are. So right at that time, people are starting to give socialization feedback, which are going to enhance certain kinds of features in one infant and another kind of features in another infant. Again, they are doing this in an academic sense as well. So boys who do well in mathematics, they're told, "Oh, you're naturally good at this." If a girl is good at mathematics, very often what they'll say is, "You must have worked hard at this." Now, it's a praise, but it's praise that children respond to, which is implicit that this is not something that you can expect it to be good at, that you must have compensated for your gender. And these are known to have long-term impacts, which is one of the reasons why it is thought that girls' academic potential actually develops better in single-sex girls' classrooms, at least in the early age, where they don't have this contrast in terms of the socialization signals that they are getting. Okay, so that's children's development. Now, very briefly about adolescence. I don't want to take too long at it because I expect you to do the reading. It's straightforward. In adolescence, one of the sort of stereotypes of it is highly unstable, emotional, conflicted, rebellious. And this is thought to be kind of, very much a biological uh, sort of situation, whereas a lot of evidence suggests that this is not the case. In societies where you have an early maturation phase, so children in adolescence are starting to become adults because you don't have to go for a degree, you're starting to grow your own crops and so on. So there's a transition. You don't find these kinds of conflicts. So these are at least in part a result of the particular cultural patterns that we have. And it's also known that they are more acute. So this a lot of this mythology comes from the 60s, where there was a cultural break between the culture of the parents and the children. Whereas in the late 90s and 2000s, what you find is this is much more, the conflict rebellion part of it is much lower because children are in fact much more conservative in many ways than their parents. So certainly, you guys who are polishing your CVs and doing internships at your age, um, anybody doing that in my generation would have been immediately framed as a complete loser. एंड ये तो कंप्लीट इसको हम अटैची केस कहते थे उनको कि ये देखें बचपन से अटैची केस लेके फिरते हैं but that's the point. There's a generational change, and that means the idea of rebellious youth is not quite the way framed the way in this generation, and it also varies by culture to culture. Biologically speaking, children in their adolescence or teenagers in their adolescence are not necessarily prone to instability or conflict quite much. there are particular elements of conflict that does happen. There tends to be greater conflict with parents specifically, not generally, not with their peers and so on. And that's because they're in a role transition where they are taking more and more internal locus of control for parts of their life that had a parental oversight. Similarly, there is some evidence of greater mood swings and depression in subsets of children, of adolescents. And again, it's not fully worked out. It's not as pervasive a pattern as you would expect. And again, it is more highlighted in particular societies than in others, suggesting a part of it is sociological. What is also sociological is a greater and greater increase that you find in adolescence of what is called narcissism. Narcissism is sort of it's not sort of self-efficacy or self-confidence. It is a excessive and sometimes irrational self-regard coupled with the lack of empathy and caring and hostility towards people who don't pay the right sort of attention to them. Um, and again, this is a new pattern thought to be sociological, and the idea here is um, children's upbringing has been much more of much higher sort of ability to gain access to games or to resorts, to food, and so on. And therefore, this has led to unreasonable ideas of what is can be expected. Expectations are much higher, unreasonably high, and this is showing itself in an increasing pattern of narcissistic behavior in adolescence. Again, there are other aspects to this which I'll let you read about. Finally, the chapter also talks about later stages of life, particularly decline and old age. Um, so average age longevity has been increasing, certainly for the middle classes, and people have realized that's as significant a stage of life, and the changes in during that stage are as significant as happen in the very early stages of development. So 60 to 80 shows a lot of changes in cognitive pattern, as significant as perhaps 0 to 20. And people are just beginning to reflect on them and look at them. And because a lot more people are living on to that age, and idea is how do we, uh, in what ways can they continue to be productive members and fulfilled lives um, in that stage. And one example of the pattern that we are finding is a change in intelligence, and at the same time a gain in intelligence. So it depends on how you define intelligence. One way of defining intelligence is what is called crystalline intelligence or crystallized intelligence, which is the total sum knowledge of facts, ideas, readings, exposures, concepts that we have. And this crystallized intelligence keeps on increasing with age. There's no decline in it. In fact, there's an increase, continuous increase. In contrast, we have what is called fluid intelligence. This is the rate at which you can make deductive outcomes, rate at which you can carry out immediate working memory type of conclusions. And this does slow down and show a decline uh, after the 60s. So the idea that cognitive abilities in the elderly decline is really a question of how you define your terms. By one definition, it keeps on increasing. By another, it does tend to decline, but the decline can be to a significant degree stabilized by keeping mentally active, mental exercises like doing crosswords and so on, but particularly by a locus of control internal to you. If you are making an effort to gain control and keep in control of the everyday activities of your life, that shows a much more stable pattern, even of fluid intelligence at much later stages in life. I'd urge you, finally, to read the little section by Erik Erikson, who talks about each stage of life having a particular existential or cognitive challenge. So in the last stages of life, it is decline versus stability. So you've lost your friends, your job is over. So to what degree are you able to keep your life meaningful versus going into decline? Whereas someone in your age, the challenge that you're facing would be to what degree you're able to identify your own lifestyle and challenges which feels right for you, rather than making do with something that you've copied from other people or from your group that you're part of, or your parents or whatever. So each stage of life suggests Eric has its own sort of challenges. All right. So that is the uh, lectures on development, and we can expect on announcement a quiz for that a little bit later. All right. Take care. That's it. Thanks.